Brethren, is it true that there's no place in the New Testament after the death of Jesus Christ where the Sabbath is commanded? That is a typical argument that is used in the world that, once Jesus Christ died, we entered the new covenant. And with the new covenant, the only things that are enjoined upon us are those things that are discussed after the death of Jesus Christ. Now, that statement on its own is fallacious. But, that's how some people think. But going back, let's say you've got a discussion with a friend or a relative or a next door neighbor, and they say, well, I would keep the Sabbath if there were just some place in the New Testament that said we had to do it after the death of Jesus Christ. Well, is there such a place? Well, we talked about that on our Bible study midweek. And we gave an answer to that, but all of you weren't there. So I thought it'd be good to go through that and maybe add a little more than we did at the Bible study. Let's take a look over at the book of Hebrews, chapter 4. Hebrews chapter 4. In this chapter, there is a rest. The word rest is used. And it's used in a number of different ways, which we'll get to as we go through the sermonette today. But we want to take a look over here at chapter 4 and verse 9. Hebrews 4, verse 9. Where it says, "There remains, therefore, a rest for the people of God." A rest for the people of God. Now, the Greek word rest in every other verse throughout Hebrews chapter 3 and chapter 4 is kataposis. In chapter 3 and chapter 4, every time the word rest is used is the word kataposis, which just basically means rest. We don't have to go into a lot of Strongs. I mean, we could, but when you would do that, you would see it just means rest. However, in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 9, there is a different word that is used. And the word there is sabbatismos. Sabbatismos. This is the only place in the entirety of the New Testament where this word is used. Sabbatismos. S-A-B-B-A-T-I-S-M-O-S. Sabbatismos. I'd like to quote from the Anchor Bible Dictionary regarding the word sabbatismos, and I quote, "The word Sabbath rest, translated as sabbatismos, is a unique word in the New Testament. This term also appears in a Plutarch for Sabbath observance and in 4 post-canonical Christian writings." So in other writings of the day that use that word, the way the word is used means a seventh-day Sabbath celebration. A seventh-day Sabbath celebration. Continuing on with the Anchor Bible Dictionary, it says, "The experience of Sabbath rest points to a present rest, which we see those who have believed are entering." So let's look at chapter 4 here, verse 3. Hebrews 4, verse 3. "For we who have believed do enter that rest." So here we're talking about Christians, you and I, and this is one of the ways the other word is used, kataposis. It's talking about how we as believers have entered into the rest of Jesus Christ as Christians, as New Covenant Christians. We look at verse 11. It says, "Let us therefore be diligent to enter that rest." Now, that's a future rest. Again, the same word, kataposis, is used there, but the idea there is the rest we have in the kingdom of God, a future rest. So we see the word rest here is used in the way that we have a rest in Jesus Christ right now. Jesus Christ said there in Matthew, I think it was chapter 11, "Come to me, all you labor and heavily laden, and I'll give you rest." Okay? So we see how the word is used, but it's used in a very special way. Going on with the Anchor Bible Dictionary, it says the physical Sabbath keeping on the part of the New Covenant believer is affirmed by the Sabbath rest, as we see in chapter 4 and verse 10. So let's look at Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 10. For he who has entered his rest has himself also ceased from his works as God did from his. So here's another underlying thought as to why we believe in the previous verse, verse 9, there remains a Sabbatismos for the people of God. And as verse 10 shows, that Sabbatismos, that seventh-day Sabbath rest, is just like what God did, as we see here in Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 10, what God did in Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. So the whole idea, to summarize the Anchor Bible Dictionary, the Sabbatismos means the keeping of the seventh-day Sabbath. Therefore, Hebrews chapter 4, verse 9 stresses the need to continue to keep the Sabbath in a new covenant context, even though the day also embodies all of its meaning under the old covenant. Now, today we're going to spend a lot of time about the Sabbath. I've got a sermon that's going to be dealing with the Sabbath and Sabbath observance. After I gave the Bible study on Wednesday, I just thought, well, there's more that needs to be said about the Sabbath, and let's continue on with the story. And so we're going to be doing that in the sermon today. By the way, lest I forget, I have been asked to consider discontinuing our Bible studies until after the feast. And apparently a number of you are feeling that way. And that's fine with me. I've got things I can be doing. If you want to do other things, you need to tend to your gardens and things like that, we can continue after the feast. So why don't we just do that? We'll just discontinue the Bible studies until after the feast, and we'll pick up again. But again, going back to our subject here for the Bible study, it's good to have a little bit of a cultural background as well when you're talking to people. You can give the explanation I just did about Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 9. But remember, the book of Hebrews is addressed to Jewish Christians. And the idea behind the book is to explain a transition from the old covenant to the new covenant. And obviously, the keeping of the Sabbath and circumcision were two of the most prominent features and tenets of Judaism. But the Sabbath had become a thing of burden because of the Pharisees and all of the things, all the legalisms, all the do's and the don'ts that they added because of their narrow-mindedness. And they certainly wasn't what God had intended. But what we see here, as Paul is writing, we believe Paul wrote the book of Hebrews, as Paul is writing here in chapter 4, Paul wants to make sure that the Sabbath is properly elevated, that the Sabbath is properly taught, that its full meaning and intent is brought out to the New Testament Christians, to the Hebrews. So this is one of the reasons why he made mention, there remains therefore, as we see in verse 9, there remains therefore a Sabbatismos, a keeping of the seventh-day Sabbath for the people of God. For the people of God. Now, as I made mention, the book of Hebrews clearly weaves together a number of themes regarding rest. Let's look at verse 8. Hebrews 4, verse 8. For if Joshua had given them rest, then he would not have afterward have spoken of another day. So we see there's a rest that was promised to Israel from its enemies in verse 8. In verse 9 and 10, we see the rest of the weekly Sabbath. It's a second way. And thirdly, we see a spiritual rest through Christ to find its ultimate fulfillment in the kingdom of God. We see that in verse 3 and verse 10 and verse 11. So is the Sabbath discussed after the death of Jesus Christ in the New Testament? Well, here we certainly see in Hebrews chapter 4 that it is.